You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show. The Cauldron of Hate, a story by Baciocco.
Chapter 11. The next Saturday was the first test for the Saddle River City Death Rays and their brand new coaches. They were playing against the Hillsboro Snoots. A more perfect, hand-picked team for the Death Rays could not have been chosen. The Hillsboro Snoots were the second worst team in the league, the team directly above the Death Rays. Hillsboro was the more affluent section of Saddle River City. The kids on the team were used to being pampered. These were kids who had butlers and maids who waited on their every whim. These were the kids who spent long days in front of flat-screen televisions the size of half of their walls of their bedrooms. They spent hours upon hours a day playing video games and surfing the internet. These were not prime athletes. The only reason they were here to play is because their parents were ready to pay the finest colleges in the country to enroll their children, and they would be allowed to play on whatever teams they wanted. The kids were pear-shaped, easily winded, and generally uninterested in playing. They were ripe for the picking for the newly fired-up Death Rays. The Death Rays played better than they had in their lives. They were fast, they were organized, and the better they played, the more confident they grew, which in turn made them better. The Death Rays' parents on the sidelines stood almost in shock as they watched their kids tear up the field. They were working as a team and were leaving the Hillsboro Snoots spinning in their cleats. At halftime, the Death Rays were up 2-1. Reese had allowed 1 goal, but he'd miraculously blocked 4 goal attempts. After each block was returned to play, he'd glance over at the living lump and tapped his temple. The living lump would return the gesture and wink back. The Blinding Skull couldn't believe how well they were playing. They were following his game plans perfectly. His skull glowed brightly as he watched them run to the sidelines where the plant lady had her ferns, handing out orange slices and waters to the players. The Saddle River City Death Rays were winded, but they were a chatting gaggle of energy. They couldn't believe how well they were working together. Their excitement was infectious, but the Blinding Skull raised his hands to try and get them to focus. Okay, settle down, he pleaded. The kids didn't listen. They were just too excited. Settle down. Now listen, we need... The Blinding Skull looked over at the living lump, exasperated. The living lump nodded. The living lump drew in a breath and then bellowed out one single word. Quiet! The sound of the living lump's voice reverberated off the office buildings that surrounded the field. Everyone in a 4-block radius was instantly silent. The birds were the first to begin twittering, and soon the general public resumed their conversations. The Saddle River City Death Rays, however, were silent. The Blinding Skull cleared his throat. Thank you, Lump. Now listen, you have all played extremely well. Your teamwork has been impeccable. You are passing to each other. You are playing smart. You have created a near impenetrable defense. But you can't get cocky. Cocky? Zoe asked. What does that mean? Overconfident, dear, the plant lady replied. Yes, overconfident. You can't become so sure of yourself that you stop playing as well. Scott scratched his head. What do you mean? The Blinding Skull smirked. He put a hand under his chin. How can I describe it to you? He suddenly snapped his fingers. I got it. Did any of you ever hear of my plan to evolve all the fish in the Saddle River City Dam with my evolution ray and turn them into a mindless army with which I could take over Saddle River City? The kids all shook their heads. Well, this was a few years back. I was young and impetuous. I had just finished creating my evolution ray when I came up with the idea for an evolved fish army. I wheeled my ray down to the dam and turned it on. It worked perfectly. In a few minutes, I had 50 or so rainbow trout out on the shore, evolved enough to breathe air, willing to follow my every command. But then I got cocky. My plan had worked so well, I figured to myself, why have a mindless army to do my bidding when I could have a relatively smart army to do my bidding? So I hit the fish with the ray again, and suddenly I had 50 or so fish who could breathe air, follow my every command, and were smart enough to drive cars and read and write. This delighted me to no end, but then I got even cockier. I rationalized, Why just have a relatively smart fish army when I can have an army of super genius fish? So I zapped them with my ray again. I then had an army of 50 or so rainbow trout who were now so super smart they actually reasoned with me why having a fish army was a bad idea and convinced me to de-evolve them and set them free. So I did. The team looked on in stunned silence. So did the living lump and the plant lady. I had defeated myself, got too cocky with my good fortune, and ruined my plans. So, how's this relate to us? Josh asked. Well, you have been playing super well, but don't get cocky just because you're winning. You need to play just as hard as you have in the first half. In fact, I'd say you'd have to play even harder, because I'm sure the coach of the other team is over there right now, trying to fire them up so that they come back on the field playing even tougher than before. So you need to focus. Keep playing like you have been, outsmarting them. And think big, Aris yelled with enthusiasm. Yes, the Blinding Skull replied, and think big. Now get out there and get 'em. The Saddle River City Death Rays all cheered loudly and sped off to their positions as the ref prepared to begin the second half. The plant lady and the living lump sidled up to the Blinding Skull as they watched their team take the field. The plant lady leaned over towards the Blinding Skull. I think you like them. What? The Blinding Skull scoffed. I think you like those kids, the Blinding Skull chortled. No, my dear lady. I simply like winning. It was the plant lady's turn to scoff now. Oh, sure, you say that, but I think these kids are growing on you. The Blinding Skull dismissed the plant lady with a wave of his hand as the ref's whistle blew. The plant lady looked up at the living lump and nodded. He smiled and nodded back. The Saddle River City Death Race second half was just as good as their first, if not better. The Hillsboro Snoots did come into the second half on fire, but the Death Rays had taken the Blinding Skull's words to heart and played the game smarter and harder than they had in the first half. They certainly didn't get cocky. The final score was the Saddle River City Death Rays 3, the Hillsboro Snoots 2. The team was beside themselves with joy over the win. They hugged, they high-fived, and cheered wildly. They all ran excitedly up to the Blinding Skull to see if they made him proud, and the Blinding Skull was beaming. Well, beaming more than usual. He raised his hands, and the team fell silent. You were amazing out there. You played with heart, and most importantly, you played with brains, and you laid waste to the pathetic simpletons on the other team. The Blinding Skull lost himself in his maniacal laugh. The kids began joining him, laughing wildly at the opposing team. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the laughter. Be quiet! The Blinding Skull and the Saddle River City Death Race fell silent and looked at the living lump. He smiled sheepishly and pointed to the plant lady. She's got something to say, he said in a near whisper. Everyone looked at the plant lady. The Blinding Skull crossed his arms, upset to have been interrupted. Now, I'm glad that you're all happy to have won, and you certainly do deserve to celebrate, but you may not do so at the expense of the other team. You can be happy that you have won, but don't gloat. The Blinding Skull stamped his foot on the grass. But gloating is so much fun. Well, that may be so, but gloating is certainly against the rules of this soccer league, and leading the children in such behavior would certainly get us fired and back in prison. No gloating. That team played hard and came close to defeating us today. We need to respect that. Now let's all bring our hands in and do a little cheer. The Saddle River City Death Rays all instinctively put their hands in. The living lump and the plant lady followed suit. All eyes turned to the Blinding Skull. After a moment, he sighed and put his hand on the top of the pile. 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? The Snoots! The Snoots! Yay! The Saddle River City Death Rays cheered with heart and, not gloating a bit, went over and shook hands with the Hillsboro Snoots players. Over milkshakes after their first win, the Blinding Skull was pleased with himself. I think we just may have a shot here, he said to the plant lady and the living lump. I've been redoing my numbers, and I think we may just have a chance to go all the way to the top. The plant lady dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin. Now, Skull, let's not get too carried away. We've won one game. We did, you're right, but all my previous calculations were based on this team not wanting to play. But I think they do now. I think they have the drive, the spark, and desire to really be a great team. Well, that may be true, but you can't push them. They are the ones playing, and they have to decide how well they are going to play. You are their coach, not their lord and master." The Blinding Skull skulked a little and sipped at his peach shake as his skull glowed. More thoughts on game plans swirled in his head.
You've been listening to The Cauldron of Hate. To download a PDF of the chapter you just heard, visit cauldronofhate.com. The Cauldron of Hate was written by Grant Baciocco. The story was edited by Liz Brown, and the audio was edited by Steven Staver. Music by Dan Ring. Special thanks to all the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who make this content possible. And a special mention to those who supported the producer level, including Dorothy Baciocco, Eve Cunning, Kathy Crawford, Tony Urbano, David Akers, Jamie Donmeyer, and Vicky Sebring. To find out more about becoming a patron, visit patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media. This episode is copyright 2021 Saturday Morning Media, Grant Baciocco executive producer, all rights reserved. www.saturdaymorningmedia.com. You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.